The U.S. Army on the frontier was not some unstoppable war machine steamrolling its way across the continent. It also wasn't a cartoon villain twirling its mustache while burning everything in sight. In reality, it was a very small number of tired men trying to control an absolutely enormous amount of territory while Congress argued, settlers ignored instructions, and the territory actively tried to kill them, which, as jobs goes, is a bold assignment. The frontier army existed in a constant state of this is not what we signed up for, and somehow still managed to keep the wheels from flying completely off while America expanded at a pace that can best be described as reckless optimism. Welcome to our republic.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that
sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not
one small step for man. Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
One thing almost nobody understands is just how small the U.S. Army actually was during most of the 19th century. We're not talking about legions. We're talking about overwhelming force. At multiple points, the entire standing army was smaller than the modern than a modern NFL stadium crowd. And it was responsible for an area that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. That's not spread thin. That's more like, are you flipping kidding me right now? Soldiers were stationed at isolated forts hundreds of miles apart. Communication took weeks. Supplies took longer. Reinforcements were more of a hopeful suggestion than a real plan. If something went wrong, the response was whatever troops happened to already be there because nobody else was coming at it anytime soon. This was not a precise operation. This was national expansion held together with grit, routine, and a shocking tolerance for misery. Frontier forts weren't designed to dominate the West. They were designed to keep things from going completely off the rails. Most of them were miserable places built in locations that no sane person could volunteer, like no person would voluntarily go to voluntarily, surrounded by weather that hated them and boredom that could qualify as psychological warfare. Soldiers guarded mail routes, escorted wagon trains, protected supply lines, and built roads that settlers would immediately complain about. They mapped out terrain that hadn't been mapped, repaired infrastructure that barely existed, and occasionally acted as doctors, engineers, and law enforcement because there was no one else around to do it. This wasn't empire building. This was maintenance mode for a country that was refusing to slow down. Settlers wanted the army around for protection, but only when something went wrong. They wanted soldiers nearby, but not involved. They wanted help immediately, but they absolutely did not want orders, restrictions, or anyone telling them they might cause a problem. From the Army's perspective, this was a daily exercise in frustration. If soldiers enforced federal rules, settlers complained about interference. If soldiers didn't enforce them, settlers complained about abandonment. And all of this happened while officers were trying to follow orders written by politicians who had never seen the land they were legislating. Despite that, the Army worked constantly with local communities, backing up sheriffs, stabilizing conflicts, and stepping in when things escalated past what civilians could handle. The Army wasn't replacing civilian authority. It was buying time for it to exist. And we're going to talk about native tribes, treaties, and reality. And I debated whether or not I actually wanted to do this because I'm not interested in hearing some internet keyboard warrior trying to correct me. But I decided to do it because I don't give a flip what you think. But here's the history. Without modern nonsense, right? Without, oh, this land was stolen garbage. The U.S. Army was ordered to enforce treaties. And those treaties changed frequently. They were negotiated by politicians, violated by settlers, revisited by Congress, and then handed to soldiers to enforce anyway. The Army didn't write them, didn't negotiate them, and they didn't get to ignore them. Soldiers were sent to move tribes, stop tribes, protect tribes, relocate settlers, restrain settlers, and somehow keep all of that from exploding into full-scale war, often at the same time. That wasn't moral philosophy. It was just logistics, right? And they didn't get it right. I mean, there were some atrocities. There were some nasty things the Army did. We're not going to beat around the bush about that. They failed at some points. The Army operated under civilian control, followed civilian orders, and carried out federal policy as written. If policy was contradictory or unclear or constantly changing, soldiers still had to execute it on the ground with real people and real consequences. That's how civilian control of the military actually works, whether people like it or not. It sucks. And yeah, unfortunately, a lot of native tribes died, and that sucks. But despite what modern narratives claim, the Frontier Army was not a culture re-educational program. Their job wasn't to teach values or reshape societies or run local life. Its job was to reduce chaos long enough for civilian systems to catch up. And once towns established, courts formed, and local governments functioned, the Army usually moved on. It didn't stay to rule. It didn't demand permanent control. It went wherever the next unstable frontier happened to be. And that was occupation behavior, right? It's containment. It's trying to keep, like I said, from chaos in a country that's refusing to slow down. The U.S. Army on the frontier functioned as a stabilizing force, not because it was large or powerful, but because it was consistent. It showed up, stayed put, followed order, absorbed blame for every direction, that it's just ridiculous. And they did it without collapsing. It held space while America expanded itself into existence. No grand speeches, no sweeping victories, just discipline, endurance, and the willingness to do a miserable job for decades. The Frontier Army wasn't glamorous, heroic in the movie sense, or even practically appreciated at the time. I mean, I don't think they're really appreciated now either. It was small, underfunded work, overworked, but absolutely essential. It didn't build the West. It didn't rule the West. It didn't civilize the West. It just kept the West from falling apart long enough for everyone else to argue about it later. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. Remember, history isn't boring. It's the story of exhausted soldiers holding together a nation that was expanding faster than anyone could reasonably manage. We'll see you next time.